welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss the topic of motivation. Now, this is certainly an important topic across sports, or really across performance in general. But particularly within tennis, it's important to know your reasons for why you play, and to always find a way to be motivated, whether it's in a match or longer term as an athlete. And to me, one of the big reasons, and I know we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, is that tennis is really not a game of perfect. In a course of a tennis match, there are always the ups and downs. Even in a season, there are always plenty of ups and downs. Novak Djokovic, number one player in the world, I believe last year he won 55% of his points over the course of a year, which means there's a lot of won points and there's a lot of lost points. And that ability to be able to come back from points lost and also from matches lost, which are inevitable at any level, is really critical. So having that motivation inside, having a very clear reason for why you do what you do on the tennis court as a tennis player, or really as any sort of athlete or performer in general, is extremely important to have a very clear reason for why you do what you do. So as we dive a little bit deeper into this, Brian, how would you start to break down this topic of motivation?
I think a good way to begin, Josh, would be let's just look at a general dictionary definition
Yep.
of motivation, and maybe we can build from there. So, a dictionary definition of motivation would be the reason to act a certain way or take a specific action. And in your introduction there, you can certainly see that. But what is sort of, I think, is interesting about the concept of motivation is the driver of motivation, or where are we sort of getting the rewards of our efforts, because those can drive different sorts of behaviors. And I think it would be a good idea for us today to maybe talk about motivation in some academic terms and relate it back to tennis, because I do think that this is like a complicated, or at least a multidimensional type of concept. I have players do motivation exercises, usually written exercises, and I'm sure you do something similar. And sometimes what happens with those exercises is the player doesn't really get below the surface very much. They need some prompting to understand, and that's fine. That's probably part of our role, is to help them, if we think of it almost like an onion, where we're peeling back various layers there. And so I would encourage everybody who's listening, when you begin to think about motivation, we want to be thinking about deeper and deeper levels. The more one writes about it, I think the more clarity that will come. So I thought we could talk, Josh, perhaps about some of the different sources of motivation, the different places that they come from, and probably a good starting point there would be on the difference between, and this is basic, there are definitely things in between here, but intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So again, those are academic terms. And the way I like to think of this sort of continuum of motivation is, this is the source of the reward.
Right.
Right. There might, we talk about sort of the driver, that's going to be different. But the source of the reward is either intrinsic or extrinsic. And so if we think about the reward being intrinsic, it's really coming 100% from you. You're doing this because you want it, you love it, you have a passion about it. When you excel, the most important thing to you is sort of that self-satisfaction and that pride that you feel. And we know that this is actually the longest sort of burning motivation. It's the best version of motivation to have. But as I said earlier, this is a continuum. No one is at like 100%. I mean, I would say that's pretty hard, especially in a sport like tennis.
I think it can often start like that, and then as as you play longer and longer and get better and better, I think other sorts of factors get thrown into the play more on the extrinsic side.
Yeah. Not that extrinsic is necessarily bad.
Yep.
Maybe if you're too far skewed on that, it would be. But let's face it, even the top players, they may be playing for improvement, but there's some aspect of, hey, everybody likes to win. Everyone, it's nice to get a little trophy or whatever. So it's not that it's even bad to have some sort of extrinsic outside rewards coming into play. It's, I think, from a tennis perspective, can we get the right balance so that we're not overly focused on those rewards? So, what are your thoughts on that, Josh, in terms of tennis and a good balance of these two motivational sources?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that generally when people start playing the sport, it's for intrinsic reasons. They enjoy it. They want they want to see how well they can play. They maybe it's for exercise or whatever their initial reason to play is generally not extrinsic. But as people compete more and more, as I said, these outside factors, these extrinsic factors, and extrinsic motivations often start to play a role. So I would say, as you said, it doesn't. Extrinsic rewards are not negative, and I think especially as you look at the higher levels of the game, the professional levels, even college levels, or competitive juniors that are playing tournaments. It often has their reasons for playing. At least the first things they might mention might be the ranking, the money, the fame, things like that. But then if you get a little bit deeper from there, you find that there are reasons for some of those for let's say the ranking has to do with that inner success, really achieving a certain level of success or achievement or things like that. So it to me, I often find that these extrinsic factors, or maybe it's the trophy, but really that shows that that really demonstrates to their parents or to themselves even that they've made it and that they have achieved a certain level of performance. So I think I don't I believe that when somebody's is solely motivated by extrinsic factors, that it can certainly be a problem. But having a combination of the two, and I think if you dig a little bit deeper into some of those extrinsic factors, it really does still come from within, oftentimes.
Yeah, yeah. I think also, one extrinsic piece of motivation that even when we first begin, I would say that people enjoy is just being praised for doing something.
Yep.
It's an outside factor, right? It's not, and even like kids, when they first begin tennis, a lot of how they perceive their ability comes from um, coaches and other adults that they know are involved in their tennis. So it's not just their own self perception. So that, in fact, it's probably the major source is really coming from the adults. So even I think early on, there's it may not be about trophies. They may not be competing, but if I say, "Hey, Josh, hey, great job today," that's that is something that we all enjoy, and that can be motivating for me to come back.
Absolutely.
Along with also the fact that yeah, I find this fun. I want to see if I can get better. Um, and so I think, as we go through some of these things, we'll notice that, the ones that begin with E, like extrinsic and external, also tend to be a little bit more ego involved. And I
Yep.
think that'll be a good distinction for us to make. So that's kind of like the source of the reward. I think the next distinction we should go down is the source of the driver. And this is often, who is really the one getting me or the player to go out there and train, to go out and play? Is that coming, totally from me internally, or is there some outside force? Whether that be parents or coaches or something else. And I think it's good for us to think about, okay, where is that coming from? Because again, that internal driver is probably going to be the one that can sustain us the longest.
Sure.
And whenever I think of external driving, I always think of these like college basketball coaches and football coaches who are, you see them yelling at their players, right? And that they're saying they're doing that because they got to motivate these guys. And that may work to a certain extent. It may get them really motivated kind of in a short-term moment, but that tends to tail off in its effectiveness. I don't know that we necessarily see that kind of thing normally from tennis coaches. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen though, in terms of people being pushed. So, like, when you think of the source of the driver, Josh, what's your experience with this, and how that works with the tennis players you've worked with?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think as tennis players get more and more serious, particularly junior tennis players, it's often as we've talked about on this podcast, it's often a team effort, and they've sort of built a team around them between their parents, between their coach. Maybe they have sports psychology professional that they're working with, nutritional coach, nutritionist, or whatever it may be. They've if somebody that does fitness, but they've established a team around them, and other people are invested in the results, even if they don't like to think about it that way. Even if they're the team around them, makes it clear that it's on them. If they, however long they want to play, they get to call the shots and make the decisions. Ultimately, that their parents are still, their parents, their coach, that whole team around them are investing in them. They're investing time. There's often a financial commitment, particularly for the parents, and that is often a factor at play, where if a kid, let's say, isn't enjoying the sport anymore and reaches a point where maybe they don't want to play, the parent might say, hey, think about everything, everything I've done for you, or we've done for you over this past 5 years, 10 years. We've driven you to all these tournaments, we've paid for all these lessons, we've given up our weekends. So it's and then at a certain point, oftentimes the kid is, whether it becomes unclear whether they're truly playing for themselves or for, some of the people that are surrounding them. You also see at times, it's the parents that are sort of, wanting the kids to live out some of these unfulfilled dreams, or,
Yeah,
um,
living through them vicariously.
exactly. So I think, I think it gets complicated, frankly, as people, as tennis players get more and more serious. And I think, we're talking about junior tennis players, and I think at the professional level, even more so when there's money on the line. Um, so I think it should fall on the athlete, the performer themselves, but oftentimes when they're surrounded by a team, there's a lot of stakeholders, you could say.
Well, I think you bring up a good point that I hadn't really thought about before, but you kind of help crystallize it a little bit more. Is that this, if you are on like a performance team, like this needs to be discussed as part of the team
Absolutely.
and understood that way. Um, because if you do get into that situation where there's 100% pressure coming from people on the team and the player is not having any sort of internal drive, um, they have to know what the dynamics are of that.
Yeah.
And there needs to be discussion. So I think that's actually a really good point that if, let's say, you or I were working with a performance team, this is probably something we would educate them on, is understanding what that driving is. And we'll get into a little bit later, I think this actually fits in pretty nicely with some aspects of self-determination theory, and sort of the autonomy and ownership aspect, because we're really asking the player here to own that drive more, right? And I think that that's useful. It's useful for the whole team to understand. Yeah, and as we get into adult players, and you do a lot of, I think you do some lessons with adults, and so you may find yourself in the position of being the motivator at times,
Yeah.
even in adult tennis.
Absolutely. Certain days where they're, you know, I do find I question in my own coaching, is this, is this something short term or long term? Sometimes having to play the role of that college football or basketball coach and say, come on, like, push through, like, let's be moving our feet here. Like, even if you're woke up on the wrong side of the bed today, or you're a little tired, or whatever it is, didn't get enough sleep. Like, let's go. Like, we've got 60 minutes here. Like, let's make the most of it. Where that really, to me, is more of a band-aid, and like, let's get through this lesson. Let's, make the most of this time, rather than, trying to dig a little deeper and really figure out, what's your reason for being out here in the first place. What do you want from playing? Which
Yeah.
is, which is something that generally I would try to talk about earlier. Talk about sort of that during that initial meeting, or that, whether it's on the court, whether it's talking with an athlete virtually. But the first time I talk to them, like, hey, why do you play? Why do you do what you do? Why did you start playing? What do you enjoy about it? So some of these more, I guess, deeper philosophical questions to really dig into that motivation. But I mean, sometimes, as you said, sometimes with adults, they have a lot of other things going on in their lives, and this 1 hour, we want to make the most of this. I might not see them for another week after that, or another month. Who knows? So sometimes you gotta get them into the present moment, into what's going on right now, and a little bit of that quick fix, that band-aid, is definitely helpful.
Yeah. And, we might be talking about adults who are maybe a little less experienced competitive wise, but there are also a lot of adults who are older, who play, high level, senior, national, international events. And the one thing I've noticed about them, and perhaps it's because of their journey, they're still playing, when they're over 45 or 50, that they are really good at internally driving themselves. There's not a lot of, there certainly can be some external, but, and a lot of the senior players I know also work with a coach to a certain extent. So there is some pushing of that, but it's almost like that's the reason they hired the coach, is that they know they need that little extra. It's
Yeah,
sort of like, when I was training a few years ago, um, I'm not a huge, like, I don't love working out. I don't really enjoy that aspect of things. So, because if I were to go to the gym, this would happen frequently. I would go, have all these grand plans for everything I'd be doing there. And after about 20 minutes, I'm like, I think I've done enough. I'm probably good, or I got something else to do, and I'd get out of there.
yeah,
And so I knew that about myself. And so that was one of the reasons I hired a trainer, is, the fact that I was paying money was motivating, but also the person,
sure,
you know, he or she was pushing me to do those things. So sometimes, when we're thinking about external motivation, it's not again 100% negative. It might be, so, if we know our own limitations, it might be wise to fill a gap like that. And you may need that in your coach, you may need that in your trainer, or even a sports psych. I'm glad that you brought up the part about understanding why you play. I think a big part of like what we want to get out of today is helping people really understand their purpose and passion with the sport of
yeah,
tennis, and asking them why they started I think is a really good idea. I call it like your origin story. Like how did you begin, and why did you choose
sure,
your sport? Because I think that many of us come at it with multiple sports, and we could have chosen different avenues, but for some reason, you and I chose tennis. People listening to this chose tennis, and it's always a really interesting thing to understand. So I'm curious, Josh. I'm going to put it on you. How did you get started? And why did you choose tennis?
It's a good question. So, started playing, well, really started a little bit recreationally when I was younger, but really was into a lot of different sports, like played baseball, played basketball, played soccer, and I enjoyed all of them, but none of them really stuck where it was like, this is something that I want to do all the time. Um, and then when I found tennis, but not like really the first time I'd played or anything, I used to just hit around with my dad or really my parents a little bit, very recreationally. But sort of when I started playing in a clinic and played in a group in a more structured way, it stuck. I felt that this was something that I was able to excel at, much more so than some of the team sports. I also grew up with a ping pong table in my house from the time I was born. So maybe the hand eye coordination from ping pong carried over a little bit. And, you know, from playing ping pong and everything growing up, um, playing another racket sport, I think appealed to me and I enjoyed that process. And then once I started, playing more, started meeting more friends, through the sport as well, playing tournaments and everything, and then starting to really like the competitive aspect of the sport, and you know, traveling to tournaments and pushing myself to see how high of a level I could compete at and reach within my own game, and then later going into coaching and sports psychology. But yeah, that's kind of how it all started. I would say through finding a sport. I think part of it was the individual aspect, but finding a sport that really suited me, that I was almost addicted to, and a sport that I really felt that I could excel at and push myself to be as good as I could be, rather than some of these other sports that I enjoyed, but never really felt that I wanted to, see how high of a level I could perform at. It was sort of about being on the team and, are we going to win this game today, but not about how well can I play? How good is my jump shot? How good of a batter am I? But if I was on the team and we won, that was great. But with tennis, it all fell on me. So if I lose, you might make excuses, but deep down, that person on the other side of the net was better than me today, or vice versa. So that's kind of how it started for me, and I think I've heard your origin story a little bit, but would love to learn a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I started when I was 6. Um, we belonged to a swim and tennis club, and this is back in the 70s. So tennis was super, super popular. It was
Yep.
like booming then. And I like to say that, the reason I really got into tennis is because I failed my advanced beginner swimming lessons and I swore off swimming. So tennis was the only other thing we could do. So I was 6, and I don't remember a whole lot about how much I enjoyed it, to be honest, but I think I must have, because around age 8, that's when I really kind of start to remember more. I actually made one of the tennis teams at the club. Now, I think there were like 4 teams. There was like A1, A2, B1, and B2. So I made B2, whatever, the lowest level, age 8. Um, and it was just so much fun. There were so many kids playing. The club had to hire someone to do signups just for the kids courts, and we could only get a half hour at a time,
Wow.
and we got 4 courts during the day. But there was also a backboard, so I was constantly, if I wasn't on the court, I was on the backboard. And I actually have this black and white photo from 1978 when I was 10, and it must have almost 50 kids at this small club on the tennis team. This wasn't beginners or anything else. These were all kids who played on the club team, and we would
Wow.
play other clubs in the area. Um, and so yeah, I just loved it, just being in that environment. And we went to that club every single day. Um, and around, I would say, 10 to 11, there was like a huge jump, and that's when I started playing. Back then, it was called Nelta tournaments, so USTA New England. So that's when I started getting into that, and yeah, my game really developed, and it just kind of went from there. And I think my next big jump was my freshman year of high school. So between freshman year and sophomore year, I went from number 4 on the team to number 1 on the team, and the whole top 4 had returned. So um, basically, that summer totally jumped, and I actually didn't even have a hard time beating any of them. So it was really, I'm not sure how that happened, but just a lot of match play and so forth, and my career sort of, gone from there. I think the reason I chose it over some of the other sports, I did like the individual aspect, but I also think my coach experiences, especially in baseball, were not 100% positive.
Yep.
So I think that was the biggest thing. I was a serious baseball player. Um, but in the end, I remember like when I was 13, I was playing on our all-star team for our town, and I just remember asking my parents, "Would you mind if I didn't play baseball anymore?" Like, 'cause I thought I'd be letting them down by, by quitting. And they were like, "No, no, we want you to do what you want to do." It's like, all right, I don't really want to play baseball anymore.
Yep.
And I would say it was almost 100% just because of the coaching stuff. Not that the coaches were awful, and some maybe when I was younger there were, but and that doesn't mean there wasn't in tennis. I mean, I remember having this crazy Australian coach when we were 12, who would just like line us up against the wall and like hit serves at us and just yell at us constantly. It was
Yeah.
probably, today this would not be tolerated at all. But I did not enjoy that clinic, so I left that club. So it can happen in every sport, and I actually did think about quitting tennis because of that. So I was just the kind of kid who was very sensitive to the right sort of coach
Hmm.
athlete relationship. And I'm not sure we'll get into that today, but that certainly is a part of motivation is having that social support and having a good coach athlete relationship.
Absolutely. And before I forget, I'm assuming the LT and Nelta was lawn tennis.
Lawn tennis, that's right.
There we go. But no, your origin story actually jogged a couple things in my mind as I think back to sort of where I spent a bulk of my time growing up, really between 10 and 15 or 16, as sort of went from a very recreational player to somebody that was playing tournaments almost every weekend. But number one, you talked about a backboard. I didn't have a backboard per se, but the side of my house
Yeah, I
with
use that
with
too.
the driveway
Yeah.
was my backboard, and actually broke a couple windows because of that. Um, but no, that you definitely would spend a ton of time there, and also moved around a couple different clubs, but one club in particular that played a lot of time at every Saturday night. Really in middle school and even in the beginning of high school, they would have a round robin tournament there.
Mm.
It's Trumbull Racket Club, by the way, and used to play these Saturday night tournaments every almost every week, and sort of put in my time there. Really enjoyed the process. I think some of it, we go back to that internal, external. Some of it was the winning or the trophy, winning these small trophies, and sort of showing that I could win matches. I think it certainly helped my game a lot, and I think I sort of developed more and more of a passion for it through those experiences as well. So and also coaching. I mean, I consider myself very fortunate to have been around, been coached by a number of great coaches. And not only did I want to perform my very best for myself, to show how good I could be, and what level I could get to, and for my parents, knowing that they had put a lot of time and money into my development, but also my coaches definitely didn't want to let them down. Felt very grateful for the time that they had dedicated towards me. So wanted, to sort of show them, the type of level I could play at. One of these coaches in particular, he would always say, "Be all you can be," and I think I still think back to that and try to be, all I can be, both on the tennis court and elsewhere. So I think, as you said, a coach can have a huge impact um, for motivation and for helping, helping athletes to want to achieve great things.
Yeah, and I think that's why understanding the academic side of motivation is very helpful for coaches
Yep.
so that they understand the dynamic and how they can best create that, what we often call the motivational climate, because that is super important. And I think, that makes me think about how I mentioned it earlier, self-determination theory. I mean, that certainly goes into that, the motivational climate, how we create that, but it also goes into like when we're starting to think about what is the best way for us to motivate ourselves or to drive ourselves. And I'll just give like a high level um, explanation of self determination theory. So it's quite a popular theory in psychology, developed by Richard Ryan and Edward Dacey, and basically says that once people move beyond sort of the basic needs, such as food, safety, security, there are some higher level psychological needs that we all have this need to fulfill, and three of them are really important when it comes to motivation, and they are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And we often will talk a lot about the autonomy piece first because what we mean by autonomy is some level of ownership, some level of control. And so when we're talking about like teams, and I think we even talked about this when we interviewed Bob Dallas, the idea of setting up an autonomy supportive environment where the players have some ownership of maybe how we train today or what we'll work on today, or they may run certain aspects of the practice. And that way they feel more engaged in it. They feel like they've got some ownership, some say in that.
Yep.
And so we all want to have that too, even as individual players. We want to have some sort of control or take some ownership over what we're doing on the court. And that could be as simple as, if I go train in a clinic, I want to set some of my own goals today, right? I want to get that. And that could then go with the next piece, which is competence. And we all, as human beings, have a need to feel like we're good at something. And we want to be able to pursue that. And it doesn't have to just be one thing, but I think for all of us who are listening, you've chosen tennis as one of those things that you are pursuing to be competent. You are pursuing mastery. Now, we may never get to, there are different definitions of mastery, so we may never become a master of the sport, but we're in pursuit of that, right? And that can be a real driver because we all want to be good at something.
Yep.
And that can then maybe fuel one's love of learning. And then the last piece, which I don't know that gets talked about as much in the literature, Josh, as it should, but I think relatedness is a really big part. We were just talking about the team. And it's important to understand that we as human beings are social creatures. And we do have relationships. And as a part of our sporting experience, um, relationships are important, whether we are meeting new friends, working with coaches, or maybe a doubles partner, teammates, etc. That's a big part of it. And I recently started working with a young woman, um, and I asked her, why she plays tennis. Sort of the question you had said before. And I think her really like dominant motive was friends. She wasn't so into the competition, like she liked having fun, but she kept talking about how much she loved to be with her friends. And I think it's interesting as we listen to people talk about why they play, and maybe along those lines, is trying to detect, is one of those three more dominant than the other?
Yep. And I think I think that's a great point. Try, as you dig a little bit deeper into that question of why, why you play or why you do what you do, noticing, which of those categories that answer primarily falls into. And it's interesting also that you brought up this aspect of relatedness. I mean, tennis, as we've talked about countless times on this show, is an individual sport. However, whether it's a junior player playing tournaments and seeing the same group of kids from USTA New England each weekend, or it's the adult playing in their USTA league where they're on a team, or somebody playing on their high school or college team, tennis or a USTA team tennis team for juniors. Tennis is often an individual sport within a group setting, and oftentimes, you know, people do having being around their friends and establishing their friends from their sport is one of the reasons that keeps them coming back. I mean, I even think back to some of the junior clinics I have coached in the past and currently coach, and there's a definite camaraderie among the juniors, and I think oftentimes that's one of the reasons why they want to keep playing is to see their friends. Maybe it's a little rivalry that they have between them and another player, but and even within the origin stories, you mentioned those 50 kids from the club. I mean, I think back to that same group of kids on those Saturday nights, or the group of kids, whether it was USTA team tennis or the kids I'd see at the tournaments, or even going into my high school and college days. So I think the relatedness piece, even in a sport like tennis, even in an individual sport, is huge and is underappreciated oftentimes.
Yeah, I'd agree. And even at the senior tennis level, I think it's a huge part of it. There may be
Absolutely.
other social aspects of perhaps going out to eat afterwards. So I remember in Rhode Island, now where you live, they have a great summer Tuesday night tennis league. And a big part of it was the two teams would go out after the matches and have a good time. And so we would compete hard on the court, but then there was that camaraderie afterwards. And I think as players become older, and maybe the competition is it's still, the competition is fierce, but it's not so maybe egocentric as it perhaps was earlier. There's a real sort of recognition or honor of each other as competitors. There's a lot, I think, respect that comes as players get older and compete each other against each other and keep that camaraderie, which I think is a really cool thing. And it's as a for those of us who are senior players, it doesn't mean you don't need to work on your motivation. Explore that. There are a lot of great opportunities for team tennis from a senior perspective, whether that's USTA leagues or things like the Friendship Cup. So here in New England, we have this thing where we play against Quebec every year, and it's
Really?
basically from 45s to 80s.
Wow. That's
And we alternate going to Quebec, and then they come here, and it's a fantastic event. And there are lots of other events that are similar that go all along the Eastern Seaboard, whether that's Atlantic Coast Cup or um, Talbot Cup. Lots of great things that help even senior players maintain that relatedness aspect of it. So yeah, I think that's something we shouldn't discount at all. So when you're working with players, Josh, on the concept of motivation, you ask them, why they play, et cetera. Are there any other, interesting questions that you like to ask them to make them think a little bit more deeply about their motivation and why they do it?
well, that's generally where I start things. Why how did you start playing? So if I, digging a little bit into that origin story, why you play, what you enjoy most about the sport,
Mm-hmm.
some of the experience, if you can pinpoint some times where you really feel like you've enjoyed the sport, and then also digging into the other side. Any real negative experiences that you've had? Have you ever thought about quitting? If the conversation starts to lead in that direction, but really trying to dive into that main factor and of why they play. And I often think it's helpful, as you said, to write things down. So oftentimes it can be a writing exercise where give them a minute or two to write down their main reasons for playing, and then seeing if you can take that longer list and start to distill it. Okay, can we shorten that up a little bit? What and until we get to a point where it's very distilled, very short, maybe one sentence for what's that main driving factor for why you play. And I think, as we talked about a little bit, this is really important for those down moments. Tennis, like any sport, is going to have its ups and downs. And particularly when things aren't going well, maybe you're in a losing streak, maybe you're injured or struggling to come back from an injury. That's really where it's important to have that crystallized um, reason for why you play when things haven't been going well in recent memory. Something that you can look back at for, okay, I play because this is a way that I can really demonstrate that I can make the most of my abilities or make my parents proud or whatever that underlying reason is, or one of those underlying reasons. When you're struggling to get back on the court after 3.5 months, and the future looks bleak and you're not sure when you can get back out there, you need that reason to keep on going, because it can be very easy to just say, what, this isn't worth it. So in order to balance the scales the other way, you need to be able to easily look back at that reason. Maybe it's that reason why you started playing, or that reason why at this point in your life why you play. And sometimes that shifts over time. Sometimes you started playing as a 6-year old for one reason, because sport was so much fun, and then now you're in college, or now you're in your 40s, and the reason why you play is something totally different. But having a clear idea of that is, in my view, from my experience, is really what pushes you past those lower moments. Those we talk about peaks and valleys. Those challenging times. Having that really clear reason for why you want to keep on going.
Yeah, and I think it made me think about one of those aspects of self-determination theory, the whole competence mastery piece, because I think if we are able to understand that when we play tennis, if we can connect ourselves more with trying to master the sport, more so than just about winning.
Yep.
Because let's face it, a lot of people will come to you and say, "Oh, I love to win, and I want to win, and I want to beat that guy, and et cetera, et cetera." And again, this is not about 100% focusing on mastery and never focusing on winning, right? There's some balance there, but probably most people are skewed too far toward focusing on sort of just winning and beating other people, right? The more ego involved piece.
Yep.
And that overall, eventually that can lead to a loss of enjoyment. And we've seen that in sports psychology research. So I think it's really important that we begin to connect our purpose, our motivation to pursuing becoming the best that we can become. And I remember having this conversation with some players on the Bryant University men's team a few years ago. And they were completely skeptical about my point that if you were to focus simply on by being the best player you could be, the results would take care of themselves.
Yep.
You don't need to just try to beat that one guy or whoever, or just want to beat guys. Because if it really was about that, and I kind of threw this back at them, I said, well, why are you here then? Because you're not going to win all your matches here. If it's really just about beating other people, why didn't you go to some school that wasn't quite as good, or junior college, or some other place where you would be undefeated? And then the answer becomes, well, I want to challenge myself. All right, now we're talking.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you want to challenge yourself, right? And then we eventually get to a place where that they get it, that it isn't just about beating other people. And if we can flip the script and understand that if I focus just on being the best I can be, then beating people will just be a byproduct of that. And I remember one player, he was extremely skeptical as a freshman, but he came to me, I think his junior year, and he said, all that stuff you've been saying the last couple of years, I get it. I get it now. So it took 2 years for him to get it. But if one, and you know what, his last couple of years, he worked harder.
Yep.
He made a lot of changes in his game that were um, much more in line with somebody who's just trying to be a better player, not just somebody who's trying to beat the kid next to him in practice. And I think one way to help people understand this, and this is a question I give as part of getting people to think a little bit more about motivation, is what is your definition of success?
Yep. I like that.
Right at the end of this career or whatever, how are you going to look back and say that? And for me, I like sharing the John Wooden definition of success. For those of you who don't know who John Wooden is, he was a basketball coach at UCLA. UCLA, I think, won about 10 national titles when he was the coach there, I think, including 7 in a row. And one of the things that he is famous for is not talking about winning. He was extremely process focused, extremely focused on the details, all the way down to how to put on your socks and tie your shoes, that level of detail. And so he has a good definition of success, or at least one I like to share. And I just want to share with all of you. So he says, success is peace of mind that is the direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you did your best to become the best that you are capable of becoming. And I think that there are a couple of concepts in there, Josh, that are cool. One, it doesn't talk about winning.
Yep.
It just talks about you becoming the best that you can become. We both know that there is a genetic component to success at the professional level. It's not 100% choice. It's not 100% hard work. I could work my butt off. I'm not going to become number one in the world. Just too short. A lot of things wrong. But can I become the best I can become? Well, that gives me something more to shoot for. I think the first part, though, is really key. And I remember when I first heard this, I was probably in my, or when it first maybe resonated, was when I was in my early 30s. The first part where it says success is peace of mind. And I thought about that. It's like, I don't know that I have that. My early 30s, I don't think I had that. I don't think I had this peace of mind that I had done everything I could. So there was some regret there. And so from that, though, I came up with a new motivation, sort of a new mission, which was to make the second half of my career better than the first.
I like that.
And it all became about mastery and doing all the little things that I could do, to become better. And the results, in my mind, for who I am, I'm very satisfied with, since 30, maybe that was about 32. So the next 20 years, I think it's been a good last 20 years, better certainly than my first 20 years of playing tennis. And so this definition actually was very helpful in me crafting that, and I tell a lot of the younger players is like, I don't want you to be like me and wake up at 32, 35, 40 and say, you know what? I could have tried harder. I want you to look back and have that peace of mind that for what I knew at the time, I did it. And so I think when we have that kind of definition of success and we can get more focused on mastery, we can actually go further in the game than if we're just thinking about winning or beating somebody else. But of course, tennis, because it's so individualistic, Josh, how can you not compare? How can you not say, like, I want to beat that person? So there is a fine line there. And I'm sure you've seen this in your work with college players.
Absolutely. And I think tennis, it's it's a sport where it's very easy to compare because
More so now than ever before, right? Because rankings are available online. There's UTR now. When I
exactly.
played, got the rankings either like once a year or once a quarter in the mail.
Yeah, and now your UTR is constantly updated. It's, everybody knows what your ranking is. Are you one spot above this person or one spot below that person? Actually, what you were saying about, really focusing on that process of being the best that you can be, reminded me a lot. Actually, brought jogged my thoughts all the way back to our first interview, where
Oh,
we talked to Brian Barker exactly, and he had said, for some people you might be able to reach number one in the world. For somebody else, you might be able to reach number 50 in your town. But what's really important is that you're doing everything within your power to be as good as you can be. And if there's two people playing there, and one saying, I want to just try to do my best today, I just want to be the best person, the best tennis player, the best person that I can be. And the other says, yeah, I want to do all that, but I also need to win. Who's gonna? It almost makes me laugh even thinking about it. Who's gonna have a better chance, really, when the match is on the line? And I think also who's gonna get more fulfillment out of that experience.
yeah,
So
win or lose, right? Win or lose that person.
win or lose. And I think back to my own career, and there's definitely matches that I lost, but I came off court saying I did everything in my power to give myself a fighting chance. I had a good attitude. I changed my strategy up. I had a plan B. Maybe I didn't have my best stuff today, but I did my best with whatever I had. And other times where maybe I've won and was not satisfied because I didn't feel that way. So having the focus on, rather than just the outcome, on winning, on doing my best on that particular moment, that particular day, I, I have found has led to greater fulfillment whenever I have managed to have that perspective.
Yeah.
Um,
I think one other question that I like to ask, and it also helps with the developing of the mastery part of our
yep.
motivation, and it's how do you want people to describe you as a competitor? And I will often, put it in a scenario and say, all right, Josh, let's fast forward a few years, and we're going to be enshrining you into some sort of tennis Hall of Fame, whether it's USTA New England, your high school, the international, whatever. And people are going to be talking about you that weekend. What do you ideally want them to say?
Yep.
And I think this is also a great place to begin to introduce some of the character skills that go into being a great tennis competitor. Things like respect and honor and fairness, along with the more individualistic traits of competitiveness, determination, certainly motivated, fighting, all that stuff, And in other contexts, I think people often think about this as like writing your own obituary. For me, from a tennis perspective, that's a bit morbid. So why not do Hall of Fame? But I found that to be what I find interesting here is about 25% of the time, people forget to include how they treat other people as part of their legacy.
Okay. Interesting.
Um, and so they're kind of maybe forgetting that relatedness piece. They're kind of forgetting um, how important it is that there's an interaction between us as opponents, but also as partners in helping each other be better, or even with teammates. I think it's important to understand that the word competition is based on the Latin. That doesn't mean to strive for against. It's the Latin definition. The Latin word competere means to strive for with, and it's in which is I think a good way to look at even in tennis. Josh, if you and I have a great match, I made you better, you made me better. I should be thankful that you pushed me. In that way, it's almost like this cooperative competition type of thing that we're also seeing in other sports, on individual sports where people are training together. Can we cooperatively compete so that we're both raising our levels and we're achieving levels we never could have gotten to without each other? And sometimes it's a little bit too much adversarial in tennis.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, in an ideal world, that reminds me of sort of that academy format, where people are many players have the same goal of reaching the highest levels of the sport. Maybe it's the pro game, maybe it's college scholarship, whatever it may be. But day in, day out, they're all pushing each other. They're competing, but they're competing to each raise their own level. And I think you see that also in college form. I realize you asked about what the college setting, and I didn't really respond to that last time. But yeah, I think certainly in a college setting you see that as well, where we've talked a lot about match play being an important piece of the college tennis environment. Really, I would say for all tennis players, they should be playing matches to continue testing themselves and challenging themselves. But I think college tennis is an ideal environment where people are on the same team. They're all fighting for the same thing. They have shared goals, but they're also pushing each other and challenging each other so that they can raise each other's games and get to that highest level possible. So I think whether any sort of team environment that we talked about, that related piece, is a great chance for players to push each other so that they can raise each other's game and also raise their own games day in and day out.
So as we think about, motivation, maybe we'll kind of start to circle back to, what do
Yeah.
we want the listeners to get out of this? Um, what do you think are some things, like if you're a player listening to this, that he or she could do to increase their levels of motivation? Because I think we should think of it like a skill. It's like there are always new levels of skills. Can we be pushing new levels of motivation?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, that first step, really, that most important step, is to really be clear about your reasons for playing, for being out there. I think knowing that um, improving at anything takes time and hard work, and that you're not going to be willing to do that over the long term unless you are very clear with yourself about why it is that you do what you do. So I think that first thing is doing a little bit of soul searching, and it takes time, and maybe you write it down one day and you revise it and you distill it a little bit, and then it changes and you crumple it up and you start again. But starting that process of really trying to dive in deep and figure out why it is that you play. Why do you enjoy to play? What are your main driving factors for playing? So I would start there.
And I think as players do that, and then they also think about their training, is to make sure that as part of that intrinsic motivation, that internal reward, that we're keeping like enjoyment as being an important part of it.
Absolutely.
Whether we call it fun or enjoyment, I'd say probably enjoyment is a better, depending on your level, right? So if you're just beginning and you're 5 or 6 years old, it's probably going to be more fun. But as you get better and become more competitive, it's probably more about enjoying the process, enjoying the struggle, etc. And that should be something we try to keep in there. And maybe even also enjoying training. So, like from a coaching perspective, if we're setting up the motivational client, we want to make sure that training is not super repetitive so that the players are getting stale. And even if you're training on your own, make sure you're mixing it up, doing different things so that it can help you stay more motivated. So I think we want to make sure that however we write that sort of like purpose and passion and why piece, try to keep enjoyment somewhere in the mix there because that's important. We want to make sure we're enjoying it. Otherwise, why? You could go reflect that question. Why are we doing it if it's not enjoyable?
Right.
right? So
No, that I think that's a great point. I think that people often lose sight of that, where, as we talked about, that 5-year-old that's playing for the first time, and they just love hitting the tennis ball. It has nothing to do with winning. It has nothing to do with what other people think about them, or their image as I am a tennis player, but they just enjoy the sport. And I think the more that you can, you know build that in and remember that, as you train, as you get more serious, as you continue playing throughout your life. I agree that that's a very important piece. And within my own coaching, I try to, maybe sometimes better than others, but try to include that as well. Where if somebody's, I mean, I would say at a core level, if somebody's not enjoying something, how much longer are they going to keep coming back? How much longer are they going to keep playing? Where if they enjoy the process, they're going to keep coming back and they're going to keep getting better. So that's sort of just at a very basic level. But no, I agree. I think that enjoyment piece, and as you said, mixing it up, keeping it new and interesting is very important for, as coaches or professionals, helping people remain motivated and remain interested, in that gradual, slow improvement process.
yeah, yeah, because the tennis obviously is it's a difficult sport to master. Takes takes a long time to get there. So
Absolutely.
um, maybe just to summarize it for people, again, the self-determination theory, just the three things to try to focus on when you're thinking about why you play and bringing some purpose. So number one is autonomy, making sure that you're owning the process. You've got some passion for it. Um, I think from a tennis perspective, especially as an individual sport, that whole mastery competence thing is super important.
Yep.
But that is like our real primary pursuit. It's like our big purpose is to become a master of this sport, and then we can't discount the relatedness aspect of playing tennis. It's such an important part, whether that's your relationship with your coach, your parents, your significant others, family, friends, the tennis community in general. There's a lot of good sort of motivational power that comes out of that. Anything that you want to add to that, Josh?
I mean, maybe, as we start to wrap up, I mean, I think we talk a lot about goals. We talk a lot about goals as sports psychology professionals. Coaches often will bring up goals, but I think these goals have to be underlined, by motivation and by really what your driving factor is for achieving those goals. If you have a goal to become whatever number one player in the world, let's say, or the number one player at your club for your age group, then that's great. But why is that your goal? Why are you motivated to achieve that? So, as we've talked about, digging a little bit deeper into that, and having that clear intention, and is going to be a key to getting to that point that you want to, achieve as a player, athlete, or performer of any kind.
Yeah, I think it's good that you brought up goals because if we go, some people might say, well, hey, should I have goals like that if it's about that definition of success, trying to be the best I can be? And I would
Right.
say, yeah, you still should because those types of goals are like milestones along your journey to becoming that. So you're essentially giving yourself like some targets along your journey toward becoming that. So I think it's totally fine that we have those types of outcome based goals. Then, of course, we want to work into all right, what's the process for creating, getting to that goal, right? So I think that's a good point. Goal setting is we don't necessarily want to look at it as the a panacea for everything in sports psychology. Sometimes it is, but I think it is important to that it has a place in there, and it's certainly a part of motivation. So, well, that's our show for today. Thank you, Josh. It was a really good discussion, I thought, on motivation. If you have any feedback or questions for us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag of TennisIQ, Also, we'd like you to subscribe to the show on your platform of choice. We're also on YouTube. So when you subscribe, you get notified of new episodes. You can also check out our Instagram page where we've been putting up links to our episode. And thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.